Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Leaders in Lending. I'm Matt Snow here with Will Robinson from Encapture. Will, welcome to the show.
Hey, Matt, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Maybe let's get started by a little introduction. Talk about what you do at Encapture, what they do, and how you got to the role of CEO there today.
Yeah, it's kind of a wild journey, but in Capture, we are a software company in the intelligent document processing space. So that means we have artificial intelligence that can read documents and understand what type of document the system's looking at, and then can go find important data in those documents and pull it out automatically. We work in a bunch of different use cases across a bank, mostly around the kind of loan origination and processing space for mortgage, commercial, consumer, indirect auto. We do stuff in the branch as well. But essentially, any workflow where there's a lot of incoming paperwork and there's important data in those documents, we can come in and really automate the manual data entry type tasks and the manual stare and compare that is so prevalent in the back office of many financial institutions.
Gotcha. Yeah, makes sense. And I know as we've talked, a lot of similarities that we've had. You've been on both sides now in a bank and supporting banks on the service side. What's your experience been like on both sides of that? You compare and contrast. Like what are the similarities and differences you've seen?
Yeah, it's there's a lot of paperwork in banks, and it's funny. We have a famous story around our business where we had a newly appointed chief digital officer of a bank, of a big bank, and we had a meeting with him, and he confidently said, my mandate is within the next 24 months, we're going to have no more paper around the bank. This thing is going to be completely digital. That conversation was 12 years ago. And needless to say, there's still plenty of paper flying around, and that chief digital officer no longer is in his role. It did not last very long. So I think it's an interesting dynamic in our industry where banks are trying to become more digital, more automated, more efficient, but yet you've got legacy processes. You have a lot of regulations that drive collecting documents from your borrowers and your customers, and there's a lot of compliance that still revolves around having a physical or even a digital copy of someone's driver's license or a bank statement or a pay stub. And so, how do banks kind of figure out ways to move into the next century, but also satisfy these demands on them? So it's a pretty unique. It's a hard thing relative to other industries. I think it's hard for banks to try to figure out how to navigate all this.
Yeah, lots we could dig into from there for sure. Especially like you said, the requirements around gathering documentation. I know we see that could be different to the state down to the county level. Like, how do you guys think about, again, you think banking and regulation and government like being two very legacy driven, slow to change areas? Like, how do you manage across all that different nuance and process?
That's a good thing about AI these days, and as it's evolved, there is a lot of variance, and there's these legacy regulations. Every local jurisdiction has a different way of doing things. Every bank has a different way of doing things, and a lot of the policies at the bank are kind of entrenched, and trying to completely overhaul that is probably, candidly, it's probably too hard for most banks and lenders. And so instead, it's how do you use new technology? How can you use AI to really augment your existing workflows? You're not going to try to change the whole paradigm of the bank or the regulatory landscape under which you operate, but can you use AI to automate some of the most kind of mundane, boring, routine tasks that you've had to do in the past? And so it's interesting. I hear there's obviously a lot of talk right now about AI. This is something that we've been doing for years and years. So we're not new to it, but we chuckle because finding like really practical use cases is still a challenge for a lot of banks, as well as a lot of technology partners that want to sell AI stuff into a bank. You have to show up with a really proven really ROI effective use case, and that's hard for a lot of folks to do.
Yeah, I want to dig into some of those use cases because I don't know if you've experienced this as well. I'm kind of getting the sense that maybe you have that when banks talk about becoming digital or making their process digital, they're just taking that same like tired, cumbersome offline process and putting it on the internet. So they're not thinking about how can we use these new technologies, tools with AI to make it easier for the consumer or even internal staff. And it's just digitizing the same process. How do you think about, are those things different or similar? Or what's your perspective?
It's really important, Matt, that we do this a lot when we start out with a bank and we start talking about implementing our own product Encapture to help streamline, a specific workflow. We have to get really specific. What is it that we're actually doing at the bank? What are we actually replacing? What steps are you guys doing today that either you're not going to have to do anymore, or you may have to do them differently? That change management process is probably one of the biggest um, risk points for a bank that's trying to adopt AI, because it does, for it to work, it requires you to maybe think about changing your process. And you can't just necessarily always layer it on the existing way you do things. A lot of times you should try to start with that, but it will require maybe a different way of thinking about a specific process or people's roles and responsibilities. And, we've seen this, unfortunately, on our side where, we'll come in, we'll build a really good solution that can save that bank a lot of time, a lot of money. But then there's so much resistance to changing a process to accommodate this AI that like they don't get much value out of it. And that's where we have to have these hard conversations on. It's not just the technology that's going to show up and solve all your problems. You have to be willing to change. You have to be willing to adapt. Um, and we're going to try to make that as easy as possible. But it's very much a mindset as well as you go into a kind of an AI specific project.
Yeah, that's really true about the change management of all of this because, like you said, you want to get really specific on the use cases and but not make it a complete overhaul of a system because then you get paralysis analysis or you don't know where to start if you think you have to rip and replace an entire process or system. So I'm sure understanding the entire landscape of a process and then digging in on those use cases is probably pretty critical to getting folks excited about starting on that journey and then keeping going.
Well, and it's funny too. I guess this is human nature, but people get very comfortable with the way they do things. And we had a situation recently where we had built a solution to help a bank um, spread all the tax returns that they gather as part of their small business lending process. So, a small business lender, a banker at the bank is going to work with a borrower and they're going to be sending in tax return documents instead of the bank now, instead of these credit analysts or these processors having to manually go through the tax returns and enter all the income information. We do that automatically. We can read through the documents, extract the data, we put it in the system. And we were talking to one lady and about her team, and I said, "Hey, how's it working?" She goes, "Oh, your software works great, but nobody's using it." And I was like, "Well, why?" And she said, "Well, they don't like skipping this step. They really like manually entering all the data because they say it quote unquote helps them understand the loan better and get to know the loan and get to know the borrower, and they can kind of think as they go along." And I kind of threw my hands up and laughed. I said, I don't know if I can do anything about that. And she laughed too. She said, "No, it's hard to get people to think about changing their behavior, especially if it's become ingrained in the way that they work and the way that they make decisions." And so we talked about a couple of kind of practical ways to maybe let these people trust the system to do it correctly, and they can go back and review later. But that's a hard thing, and I would, if you are kind of an exec for a lender and you're thinking about implementing new technology, whether it's AI or anything else, I think it's good to honestly ask yourself, do I have a team that is willing to change, embrace change, try things differently? Or can I go find maybe a few folks that can be leaders in this area and can kind of be the advocates for the change? Because if you're not willing to change or really push that, and push your team to change, whatever you implement, regardless of technology, it probably is not going to work very well.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that's a really good story, a really specific example, but maybe highlight some things that we could dig in more broadly around AI. And as you said, like being able to trust any system really is probably key to adoption. And AI, for better or worse, I think brings with it a reputation of being a quote unquote black box or something harder to understand. So maybe we could start a little bit just like getting more specific around the term. And as you've used it a couple times, like when you think about what Encapture does and how you guys use AI, like what does that specifically mean, or what are some of the approaches that you're taking to make your things easier?
It's funny, Matt. We've been using AI, and specifically what we use is supervised machine learning. I can explain what that is in a second, but we've been using this for like the last 4 to 5 years. And up until about a year and a half ago, we didn't even say the words AI or say machine learning because it would just scare everybody. Uh, People have these preconceived ideas of what AI means, what it is, what it isn't, what it does at the bank, and we just felt there was so much barrier, there was so much kind of pre-existing biases against it that we really referred ourselves more to kind of an automation technology or an automation platform. And it wasn't until ChatGPT about 18 months ago kind of entered the public lexicon and everybody kind of got comfortable talking about AI and realized, hey, for better or for worse, I'm going to have to figure out a way to use some flavor of AI going forward. That's really allowed us to speak, I think, a lot more candidly about it. And so, uh, I won't get into all the weeds on all the types of AI that are out there, but um, there are several different strategies and techniques of using artificial intelligence. That's a really, really broad term. What we do around supervised machine learning is it's almost like we have, this software that almost behaves someone like a fresh college grad that's maybe in their very first job, and they're smart, they're willing to learn, but you really have to teach them what the job is and what they're expected to do. And so in our use case, we have trained our machine learning models to recognize certain types of documents. So we'll feed it samples of documents, and we'll feed it a bunch of different driver's licenses and say, hey, these are driver's licenses. And then we'll feed a bunch of samples of bank statements and say, hey, these are bank statements. And all the while, the system is looking at these documents and looking at maybe some of the similarities and some of the differences between the document types, so that one day I can show up with kind of a mystery document, give it to the system, and they can look at it and say, okay, is this a bank statement? Is this a driver's license? Or is this something else? And the more that you can train them and teach them and give them hints, give them rules, give them reminders, or reinforce kind of positive decision making, the better it is at kind of, I would say, guessing the right outcome in terms of what document it's looking at or the data it's looking for. So that's a really kind of simplified version of how our machine learning works, our AI. That's actually very different than what Chat GPT is, as you guys have heard around generative AI. That's a different type of AI that, instead of kind of guessing an answer to a specific question based on previous training, this AI is more about creating new content and trying to figure out what's the next word that I should say in this sentence so that the sentence is complete and makes sense relative to the question that was asked. So use cases there for generative AI are a bit different than kind of the AI we use for reading documents. And I think it's important for someone who's looking to bring on AI to understand, hey, tell me how your AI works. Tell me how much of a black box it is, because in our case, we have kind of intentionally designed our AI to where it's less of a black box. In some ways, you would say, well, maybe it's not as effective. I would argue, well, we at least know how it's making the decisions it's making, and so every time it makes a decision, we can point to kind of the way it went about that versus it being some just magical thing that comes up with an answer and we don't know how it gets there. So that's a big part of it. And then the other thing is, especially for banks and lenders, credit unions, where are you using AI in your organization? It's one thing if you're using AI like ours, which is just really kind of automating these mundane tasks, replacing manual data entry. It's different if you're trying to use AI to make a credit decision, or you're using AI to have a conversation with a customer, or provide kind of a more native kind of conversational onboarding experience for a customer. Those all have kind of their own unique risks and challenges. And again, for lenders specifically, there's a lot of regulation that would say, hey, if you're going to put AI in to make a decision on a loan, you better have a lot of confidence that you understand how that system is making that decision so that you can prove it's not discriminating against certain types of borrowers.
Yeah, totally. I think every application, we keep coming back to the idea of use cases, but defining those use cases, understanding the risks and trade-offs are definitely important. I think when you're embarking on this kind of a journey or deciding if an AI application is right for a certain use case and really understanding the benefits you get there. And you mentioned compliance too. I think sometimes folks maybe view that as a more adversarial relationship, or different levels of government will come out with their perspective or recommendations on use of AI. But we talked before about how can you use AI in more of a proactive way, or being more compliant, or helping stay within regulation and guidelines. How have you guys thought about that, in ways that you can actually use this technology to help you maybe show up better in those cases?
Yeah, it's funny. There has been this growth in uh, regulations for banks and lenders, and how there's more and more data that has to be reported to the government to make sure that you're not discriminating in your lending practices. There's recently been a revamp of the CRA rules, which have been around for 50 years, but those have expanded. There's this upcoming, Dodd-Frank 1071 rule. And I realize I'm saying a lot of acronyms here, Matt, but I'm sure your listeners will know what these are. There's just this growing body of reporting data to the government. And, what we found for our use case is there's a really good solution here. A lot of times these compliance teams are having to go review loan packages to make sure that the data they've pulled out of their system that they're about to report to the regulator is accurate and complete. And so they spend a lot of time hunting and pecking through big loan package PDFs, double checking various data points against the system. It's a very time intensive and kind of cumbersome process. Most teams can't even check every loan. They don't have the staff or the time to do that. So they'll just sample a few loans. And that's a great use case for AI. And again, we're not, it's not something where we're manipulating data and reporting without it's not this black box scenario. It's simply saying, okay, AI, I want you to go through all of my loan packages, and I want you to pull out the data that I need to report. I want you to compare it to my system, and I want you to flag any discrepancies. And what we found is 90 to 95% of the data points that are being reported, they're accurate, they're consistent, and you don't need to do anything with them. But maybe it's 5 or 10% of your data points are they're missing data fields, or it's a different name. It should say Will Robinson, but instead it says Matt Snow, and you need to go figure out why that is. And so it cuts down on a lot of this kind of mundane data scrubbing activity that these compliance teams do. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing about, you hear about compliance and banking and regulations going to restrict AI. Ironically, banks are using AI to facilitate their obligations under the regulations. So, I think that's it's kind of been an ironic twist of AI helping banks, even though it's going to get cracked down on, I think, more and more.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's a good example too of where, especially with human resources that are very expensive and limited, like, can you use a combination of these two tools, right? The AI that can help you focus and prioritize or find higher risk signals. I think we see that a lot in terms of verification in underwriting as well. Like, if you're seeing tens of thousands of applications in any day, which ones do you focus on? Where do you put the human capital against that, and where should you focus on types of documents or types of fraud? And being able to partner those two together, each with their unique skills, and either handling volume or novelty in the data, I think can be a great win.
Yeah, we get asked this question a lot, and it's like every conference you go to, that's a big question. How do I use AI in my bank? And I kind of chuckle because I have not heard many people show up on these panels and give like 3 or 5 or 7 or even 10 good answers. Like, usually there's kind of one use case or two. And I think it's because sometimes you hear about all the potential of AI and it's hard to figure out where to start. And there's so much hype around what it could do that I think people miss, like, what are some really, really practical things it can do today. And so we always just encourage people. And again, this is unique to our business a little bit in the fact that we process documents. But go look through your existing workflows and look at where people are spending a lot of time doing repetitive tasks that are highly rules based, right? You probably have a rule or a process, because in those situations you can use technology to automate that. It doesn't even have to be AI. So much of what a loan origination system is, which those have been around forever, is really just making sure you're applying your bank policies and bank rules around a process and around an underwriting set of decision making. So that, and there's no AI in that. So I do think it's important, that you first take stock of, do we have tight repetitive processes that can be automated? The flip side of that is, don't try to go use technology or AI until you've got that part down. We struggled with this a lot with some of our customers. They will be so excited about using AI. Oh, you're going to automate our loan origination process, and you're going to help, make sure that we're following all these rules and we're collecting all the right documents. And we're like, yeah, that's great. Tell us your process. Tell us your rules so we can make sure the AI is following your rules. And then quickly you realize they don't really have clean rules. They don't have consistency on what the rules are. This was a couple of years ago, but we rolled out a solution based on what the project team at the bank had said. These are our rules, and this is how we process loans. And so we started testing it with actual users, and they revolted. They were like, this thing is terrible. And we said, well, why is it terrible? And then we uncovered it's because they could not agree internally on what even the rules were or the standard processes were. And so they thought that, it was AI's fault. And we were like, hey, we can make this do anything you want, but you have to have consistent standards at the bank that you can follow. Otherwise, this is not going to help at all. So I think starting with kind of, making sure you have clear process, making sure that if you're going to be using data, your own data, to help with an AI-enabled project, making sure that data is clean and well-structured is really important. Again, this happens a lot with us. We look at documents, and so a lot of times we'll go into a bank and say, "Hey, pull us samples of these documents, so we can make sure our machine learning model can read it." Well, they don't have their documents saved down very well, and they don't know where they are, or they have a misclassified or misindexed, and so we start with a really dirty sample set, and it just doesn't go well. So there's a lot to do here on the AI front, but I think just taking a step back and looking at, hey, what are the most mundane, routine, repetitive things that my team's doing every day that's taking a lot of time and maybe is not very much fun, and how can I go automate that? And there'll typically be a good use case there.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if you were advising somewhere, at a bank or a credit union, thinking about automation, use of AI, how do you think about the, build versus buy, or what are the different dimensions? Is it like you said, the type of data that I have, or maybe a third party would have access to, the skills I have natively, and evaluating each of these different use cases that might exist? How would you advise someone to think about, is this something we should try to tackle on our own or start looking for help outside?
I think it's really a function of how big is your bank, how big is your budget, and what are you trying to do? I do think the biggest banks, the JP Morgans of the world, they have the budget and the appetite to kind of build as much as they can in-house. At the same time, we work with some of those biggest names, and what we found is the problem that we're solving for them is really important to the business, but from a IT or product perspective inside the bank, it's not very important. So the bank's not going to get to it, even though they could build it. It's going to take them a year or two to get there. And so the business is like, hey, I need this solved now. So I would say if you're like a line of business leader at a lender, I think just being honest with yourself and with your team on, maybe my bank says they want to build it, or they say they can, or that they say they're working on it, but when's it really going to be ready? Versus if I can find a vendor that can solve this, and what's the cost of that, and what's the timeline of getting that in. I think you'll realize, even if the long-term plan is for the bank to build it themselves, I think you can probably get pretty far with a vendor early on. So in terms of most banks, just cutting to the chase, most banks are ill-equipped to build technology internally. Most banks are. They're just not set up for that. It's not in their DNA. It's not their culture. They don't have success with it. So again, most banks, it's better to partner with vendors who've done this for a long time. And again, do really good diligence on your vendors. Ask for referrals. Make sure that they've got a long body of evidence of this being successful. Ask for a lot of details around their process and how their technology works. A good vendor who's been doing this a while will have no problem sharing that, and will have good documentation around that. If you feel like you're working with someone who's maybe trying to figure this out alongside you, that's okay, but just be aware of that they're trying to figure it out alongside you, and it may not go as well as you're hearing in the sales process. So, I think there's going to be more regulation around this as well. We were talking about that earlier, Matt. Kind of, where's regulation going around this? The state of Colorado just passed a law requiring organizations that use AI in these they call it these high risk or high impact areas, to have a lot better governance around what is the AI doing, what data is it touching, what is it doing with that data, how is it making decisions, how is it impacting the outcome of the bank, is it discriminating, is it being biased towards certain things. So I think more and more regulation is going to come out on that. And again, vendors like ourselves, we have answers for all that. And so making sure that your vendor understands what's going on, I think will give a lot of confidence.
Yeah, the transparency and trust, I think, is key. And bring it back to what you said earlier about, maybe the LLMs and Chat GPT bringing more awareness to the space in general. Have you seen your partners, asking harder questions, getting into deeper diligence, or are you still having to do a lot of education on, what some of the terminology is, the mechanisms you're using in this space to help demystify some of that?
It's a wide spectrum. I will say this: most banks are doing a good job that when they hear AI, kind of the red flag goes up and they ask more questions. So like, this is not just a routine. I'm not just buying, more telephones for my office desks at my company. This is something I need to have a better understanding of. And so we do a lot of education around that. And again, AI is such a broad term. There's so many different techniques that, like, what I tell you about how our stuff works does not mean every other AI vendor out there is going to work the same way. In fact, most of them won't. And so getting a good understanding, making sure that your vendor can explain it crisply and simply, because you're going to have to go turn around and explain it to your bosses. What is it that we're putting in? How does it work? How do we make sure it won't, run afoul of any of our fair lending regulations? How am I going to get people to buy into it? And so I think if you can understand how it works simply, then you'll have more confidence that it'll work well.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things I found is, while it's certainly important, pre-contract and as a one-time event, it's also an ongoing exercise because, companies like ours, I think, are constantly trying to find the next new innovative approach, or like you said, AI is so broad that the way we're leveraging those types of technology is changing day by day. So it's really a part of the ongoing relationship, I think, if you're using a third party to stay in touch with them and how they're evolving their thinking and kind of, it's like ongoing diligence of that relationship.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a never ending, if you find the right vendor, there's typically a good chance they can do more than just one thing for you. And if they can do more than one thing, that means they're going to be sticking around for a while and they want to do more than one thing. So I think it's important when you're not just looking at the technology or the specific use case, but talking to that vendor and saying, hey, is this the type of partner? Have they been around a while? Are they going to be around? Are they really committed to my industry, my space, my use cases? Do they want to do more with me? Or am I going to be kind of a one-trick pony where they just show up, do their thing, and then leave, and they never hear from me and collect a renewal check? I think getting a good sense of that's important, because you can probably go find, just a handful or less of good vendors that can do a lot for you across the bank, and you'll make a lot more progress sticking with those lenders or sticking with those vendors and going deep than trying to find 30 different vendors who kind of each do one thing for you.
Gotcha. Well, maybe it's a good time to transition to a closing question for you. As I was thinking about our conversation today, I was thinking back to a book I read around this, Stuart Russell's Human Compatible. I'm not sure if you've read that, but I'm always trying to find whether it's a podcast, a thought leader, a book. I thought that one was really interesting, just around the idea of setting up controls and transparency around human and AI interactions. And while it was enlightening around AI and some of the topics we've talked about, it helped me think about even human decision making and maybe processes we take for granted or that are more automatic. So I highly recommend that if you haven't read it. But curious if there's anyone you follow in this space to, again, kind of stay relevant and keep your thoughts sharp in this area, whether it's a podcast or maybe a writer that you follow.
That's a good question, Matt. If I'm being very transparent, I feel like I'm following 20 or 30 people right now, and I'm still trying to figure out like who is real and legit in this, because and I also think kind of the diversity of thought in this phase of AI, it's so early. You have, well, I think I'll give you an example. I think Mark Andreessen, he's a prominent venture capitalist. He wrote a really good kind of long form essay on AI and how we should be thinking about it. Wrote it several months ago. So I do encourage people to read that. But he does talk about the concept of the Baptists and the bootleggers, relating this back to prohibition, that there are people who are going to really call for the regulation of AI, because they feel like in their hearts that's the right thing for the world. But then there are people who are going to call for the regulation of AI because they're the ones who are going to benefit the most from it. And so I think in this early phase of AI and how we use it, I think diversity of thought is really important. So you can hear kind of the different sides and then feel confident, making your own conclusions on, what does AI mean for us as a world? What does it mean for me and my business? What does it mean for my own professional development going forward? I did read an interesting quote recently, and I can't remember who said it, but it was essentially, you shouldn't worry about AI replacing your job. You should worry about a person who knows how to use AI replacing your job. And so I think there's sometimes this fear that AI is going to replace everybody, and I think there will be pockets, where AI comes in and can automate some of the things that people do, but I don't think those are the most interesting jobs. And I think candidly, it's going to create a lot more opportunity for a lot more people, and be a net benefit, just as we've seen with every major technological advancement over the history of mankind. So maybe a conversation for another day we can have, Matt. But I encourage you, read diverse thoughts, and continue to kind of keep an open mind on where this all goes.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that, Will. I think it's a really exciting time to be in industry as these tools are coming on board. And I think, like you said, the transparency, the openness in the dialogue, let's find ways to test and see what works and be open about the pros and cons and see where this goes. So yeah, I'd love to follow up with a conversation on that, and appreciate your time with me today. And thanks again, Will.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Matt. Really enjoyed it.